Hi, and welcome to this bonus lesson on the book of Numbers. You have found me out here in the middle of the wilderness, and I have with me a compass and a map. When I was about your age, maybe in high school, I learned a little bit about orienteering, about how to use a compass and a map to help navigate through an unknown area. You may be wondering, well, why didn't you just pull out your phone and ask Google or Siri for directions? Well, even if such amazing technology had existed when I was your age, you can't always depend on technology when you're out in the middle of a remote area. Well, okay, I'm not actually in a remote area. I'm just in Carson Park in Eau Claire, but you get the idea. So at this point, you're maybe wondering, what in the world does orienteering have to do with the book of Numbers? Well, the book of Numbers is kind of a book of spiritual or faith orienteering. Before I elaborate, let's just back up a little bit and see how we got to Numbers. You may remember, I hope you remember, that in Genesis, in the beginning, we heard the story of creation. And then in chapter 12, we focused in on Abraham and Sarah, and we heard their story and the story of their descendants, the story of Isaac and Jacob's 12 sons. At the end of Genesis, we find Jacob's family living in the land of Egypt because of a famine. The sons of Jacob, the family of Jacob, are now known as the Israelites. Exodus picks up right where Genesis left off. At first, all was going well for the Israelites and they prospered in Egypt. But a new Pharaoh came to power and things began to change. This new Pharaoh and the Egyptians along with him were concerned about the Israelites. They were foreigners after all, and they had become a rather large minority in Egypt. Pharaoh felt threatened, and so he started to limit their freedom until eventually the Israelites became slaves in Egypt. God, though, put a plan in place to rescue the Israelites. Working through Moses, God brought God's people out of Egypt across the Red Sea. The Israelites made their way to Mount Sinai, where Israel and God entered into a covenant with each other. And God gave them the 10 commandments along with all of the other laws or commandments. Those are called mitzvah, by the way, in Hebrew. Leviticus is the next book in the Bible, and it isn't read very much in Christian churches. It contains many of the laws that God gave to the people at Mount Sinai. Although we don't read from it very much, Jesus actually quoted a verse from Leviticus. When he was asked by a lawyer what was the greatest commandment, Jesus responded this way. He said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment." Now, this is actually from the book of Deuteronomy. But then Jesus said, "And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." This second commandment is from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. This leads us to the book of Numbers. The English title comes from the Greek translation, and it's a reference to the 2 censuses that you can find recorded in the book. The Hebrew title is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, and it comes from one of the first words of the book in Hebrew and is a reference to the book's setting. Numbers is an eclectic book. It has lots of different kinds of material in it. It has stories or narratives, like the story of Moses sending out spies on a reconnaissance mission into the Promised Land. It has ancient, really ancient poetry, like this Song of the Well from Numbers 21. Here it is. "Spring up, O well, sing to it, the well that the leaders sank, that the nobles of the people dug with the scepter, with the staff." That's pretty old poetry. It also has additional legal material that deals with things like inheritance. And it has a folk tale, the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. Yes, you did hear me right. In chapters 22 through 24 is the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. Numbers begins with the Israelites still camped around Mount Sinai, where they were way back in Exodus. But that is all about to change. The first 10 chapters contains a census and details how the Israelites are supposed to break camp and march through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. As they set out, God goes with them as a cloud by day and fire by night. Here's how Numbers describes it. Whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, then the Israelites would set out, and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the Israelites would camp. At the command of the Lord, the Israelites would set out, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they would remain in camp. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites would keep the charge of the Lord and would not set out. So God went with them, leading them by day and by night. After this opening section, the Israelites get underway and the 40-year wilderness journey begins. It isn't always easy going. If you look on a map, the distance from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land is not so far that it should take 40 years to get there, even if you are traveling on foot. So why 40 years? Well, because there's some grumbling along the way and some dragging of the feet, and because there are some roadblocks that force the Israelites to take the long way around. For example, there is trouble immediately as the journey gets started, and yes, I do mean immediately. Chapter 10 ends with these words, "So they set out from the mount of the Lord." And chapter 11 begins this way. "Now, when the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes," you see, the journey has just begun and already there is grumbling. Turns out the Israelites are tired of eating manna and long for the foods that they used to eat back in Egypt. Let's just say that God is not pleased with this grumbling, but God also has a sense of humor. The people want meat to eat, so God sends them some in the form of quails. Here's how Numbers puts it. "Then a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quails from the sea and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, about 2 cubits deep on the ground." A cubit, by the way, is the length from the tip of your finger all the way down to your elbow. That's a lot of quail. Well, this sets up a pattern then that is repeated over and over again out in the wilderness. God's people grumble, or sometimes they rebel outright against God or against Moses, which in turn makes God just a little bit angry. And there are some consequences to the grumbling and the rebelling. This is then usually followed by a plea for forgiveness, which God graciously grants. When I started this lesson, I said Numbers was kind of a lesson in spiritual orienteering. Here's what I mean. It turns out God's people need a little practice learning how to live as God's people, learning to trust God and God's promises. They need help recognizing God's presence in the cloud and the pillar of fire and trusting that God really will be with them and will help them. The book of Numbers is the story of that journey. It's an orienteering story, a story in which God's people get oriented to what it means to live and to be God's people in the world. And it is a story of how God gets oriented to God's people, how God learns to care for, to forgive and protect and lead God's people through the good times and the bad. And this is what I like about the book of Numbers. Yes, it's full of struggles and strange stories, but it is ultimately a story about the building of a relationship. It is the story of how God and God's people learn to live and enjoy life with each other. And I can relate to this in my own faith journey. I hope you can too. For both God and God's people, life is better together. The book of Numbers ends with the Israelites camped on the edge of the River Jordan, poised to enter the promised land. But the generation that left Egypt died in the wilderness before they arrived on the banks of the River Jordan, so that those who are now standing present are actually the next generation. This is the other thing that I like about Numbers. It is a story of how faith is passed on from one generation to the next, telling the stories of what God did in Egypt and what God has done for them in the wilderness, celebrating the Festival of Weeks and Passover, keeping the Sabbath. These are all ways that that first generation passed on the faith to the new generation. In this sense, too, Numbers is an orienteering story, the story of how one generation orients the next, how one generation helps the next generation prepare to live out the next part of the ongoing story, the next part of the ongoing relationship between God and God's people. We are a part of this story too, you and me and all the members of OSL. Together we are orienting each other, pointing out to each other how God is leading and guiding us. As we tell the story of all the things that God has done, and especially as we tell the stories of Jesus, we continue to live in that relationship that began all the way back in Genesis and Exodus, and that was first nurtured in the wilderness, and that has been developing ever since. Before I go, I'll leave you with these words that the Lord told Aaron to speak to the people. If you want, you can find them recorded in Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. We'll see you soon in small group.